Double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, eye of needle, tongue of shoe, hand of clock that points at two, neck of buckle, tail of coat, whiskers from the billy goat. Repulsive. Delightfully gruesome reaction.
Which is deadly Brew. I'm well aware of your emotional limitations as a human being. And, now that you've committed to getting jabbed for the rest of your time on Earth, you have further compromised your own humanity inasmuch as the patent on your genome is now the intellectual property of the manufacturer of your choosing. Is there any wonder they don't want you to mix vaccines? What a proprietary mess it leaves to be battled out in the future for our patent courts to determine between the different pharma corporations which one owns what percentage of your genome. And, so it is that you are no longer considered to be 100% autonomously human and you are no longer considered to be eligible for the protection of inalienable human rights, since you have volunteered to become transhuman. And, that is your choice. And, you made it for yourself. And, you do not have the right to make that choice for anybody else. And, the right to make the choice should never be stolen from another human. Ever. It is a crime against all of humanity to do so. I am further well aware of your depraved narcissistic covert motivations for why you wanted the children to be unenrolled from the safety of their own private homeschool and re-enrolled in the abattoir of the public schools. And, so I ask you, are their lives worth it? Do you not understand what is at stake here? Do you believe you've won when their caskets are being lowered at your feet? The time for self-absorbed power control manipulations at all costs is over. Don't you get it? The cost is their lives. Not mine. Do you only care about destroying me, and so nothing else registers in your dysfunctional brain? It is only because of you and your abusiveness that the corrupt Commissioner of Department 7, Family Law Division, Merced County, Superior Court of California, was allowed to perpetrate her discretionary abuse of power on our innocent and helpless children. You alone bear the responsibility of putting their necks in the guillotine. And so, I am appealing the illegitimate ruling that legitimized your abuse and which was arbitrarily made at the hearing on Friday the 13th. So far it has reached nearly $3,500 in court costs alone, and it is worth it. And, it is only a matter of time. And time is our enemy. Due to your reckless and demented demands upon the lives of our children, it has come to my attention that my little ones have been predictably forced to undergo PCR testing at the dirty hands of the publicly administered institutions of traditional education, where you have insisted on placing them. What's the problem? First, the PCR tests are meaningless as a diagnostic tool. Second, the swabbing process is in itself dangerous and can cause brain damage. Third, the chemical used to sterilize these swabs is known to the EPA to cause cancer in humans, and getting swabbed can contribute to breast cancer in women and sterilization in men. But, don't take my word for it. I know it is contrary to the narrative being pushed by the talking head tools of mind control on your idiot box, but what do the experts say? Refer to this article written by Torsten Engelbrecht and Konstantin Demi published in Off Guardian on June 27, 2020, titled, COVID-19 PCR tests are scientifically meaningless. Though the whole world relies on RT-PCR to diagnose SARS-CoV-2 infection, the science is clear, they are not fit for purpose. To start, it is very remarkable that Kary Mullis himself, the inventor of the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, technology, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1993, regarded the PCR as inappropriate to detect a viral infection. The reason is that the intended use of the PCR was, and still is, to apply it as a manufacturing technique, being able to replicate DNA sequences millions and billions of times, and not as a diagnostic tool to detect viruses. No proof for the RNA being of viral origin. Now the question is, what is required first for virus isolation/proof? We need to know where the RNA for which the PCR tests are calibrated comes from. As textbooks, example White/Fenner. Medical Virology, 1986, p. 9, as well as leading virus researchers such as Luc Montagnier or Dominic Dwyer state, particle purification, i.e. the separation of an object from everything else that is not that object, as for instance Nobel laureate Marie Curie purified 100 milligrams of radium chloride in 1898 by extracting it from tons of pitchblende, is an essential prerequisite for proving the existence of a virus, and thus to prove that the RNA from the particle in question comes from a new virus. The reason for this is that PCR is extremely sensitive, which means it can detect even the smallest pieces of DNA or RNA, but it cannot determine where these particles came from. That has to be determined beforehand. And because the PCR tests are calibrated for gene sequences, in this case RNA sequences, because SARS-CoV-2 is believed to be a RNA virus, we have to know that these gene snippets are part of the looked-for virus. And to know that, correct isolation and purification of the presumed virus has to be executed. Hence, we have asked the science teams of the relevant papers which are referred to in the context of SARS-CoV-2 for proof whether the electron microscopic shots depicted in their in vitro experiments show purified viruses. We ask several study authors, do your electron micrographs show the purified virus? But not a single team could answer that question with yes, and nobody said purification was not a necessary step. We only got answers like no, we did not obtain an electron micrograph showing the degree of purification. Regarding the mentioned papers, it is clear that what is shown in the electron micrographs, EMS, is the end result of the experiment, meaning there is no other result that they could have made EMS from. That is to say, if the authors of these studies concede that their published EMS do not show purified particles, then they definitely do not possess purified particles claimed to be viral. In this context, it has to be remarked that some researchers use the term isolation in their papers, but the procedures described therein do not represent a proper isolation, purification, process. Consequently, in this context the term isolation is misused. Thus, the authors of 4 of the principal, early 2020 papers claiming discovery of a new coronavirus concede they had no proof that the origin of the virus genome was viral-like particles or cellular debris, pure or impure, or particles of any kind. In other words, the existence of SARS-CoV-2 RNA is based on faith, not fact. This actually means that one cannot conclude that the RNA gene sequences, which the scientists took from the tissue samples prepared in the mentioned in vitro trials and for which the PCR tests are finally being calibrated, belong to a specific virus, in this case SARS-CoV-2. In addition, there is no scientific proof that those RNA sequences are the causative agent of what is called COVID-19. In order to establish a causal connection, one way or the other, i.e. beyond virus isolation and purification, it would have been absolutely necessary to carry out an experiment that satisfies the 4 Cox postulates. But there is no such experiment. The necessity to fulfill these postulates regarding SARS-CoV-2 is demonstrated not least by the fact that attempts have been made to fulfill them. But even researchers claiming they have done it, in reality, did not succeed. One example is a study published in Nature on May 7th. This trial, besides other procedures which render the study invalid, did not meet any of the postulates. For instance, the alleged infected laboratory mice did not show any relevant clinical symptoms clearly attributable to pneumonia, which according to the third postulate should actually occur if a dangerous and potentially deadly virus was really at work there. And the slight bristles and weight loss, which were observed temporarily in the animals, are negligible, not only because they could have been caused by the procedure itself, but also because the weight went back to normal again. Also, no animal died except those they killed to perform the autopsies. And let's not forget, these experiments should have been done before developing a test, which is not the case. Irrational test results. It is also certain that we cannot know the false positive rate of the PCR tests without widespread testing of people who certainly do not have the virus, proven by a method which is independent of the test, having a solid gold standard. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that there are several papers illustrating irrational test results. For example, already in February the health authority in China's Guangdong province reported that people have fully recovered from illness blamed on COVID-19, started to test negative, and then tested positive again. A month later, a paper published in the Journal of Medical Virology showed that 29 out of 610 patients at a hospital in Wuhan had 3 to 6 test results that flipped between negative, positive, and dubious. A third example is a study from Singapore in which tests were carried out almost daily on 18 patients and the majority went from positive to negative back to positive at least once, and up to 5 times in one patient. Even Wang Chen, president of the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, conceded in February that the PCR tests are only 30 to 50% accurate, while Xin Hangli from the Milford Molecular Diagnostics Laboratory sent a letter to the WHO's coronavirus response team and to Anthony S. Fauci on March 22, 2020, saying that it has been widely reported in the social media that the RT-qPCR reverse transcriptase quantitative PCR test kits used to detect SARS-CoV-2 RNA in human specimens are generating many false positive results and are not sensitive enough to detect some real positive cases. In other words, even if we theoretically assume that these PCR tests can really detect a viral infection, the tests would be practically worthless, and would only cause an unfounded scare among the positive people tested. So, the results of the test are scientifically meaningless. Are they safe, at least? Refer to this article published by Daily Expose on May 21, 2021, titled, COVID PCR test swabs are as dangerous as inhaling asbestos. An experimental physicist and biomaterials researcher examined various PCR test swabs under a microscope and found that the fibers they contain are as dangerous for human beings as inhaling asbestos. Professor Antonetta Gatti examined various PCR test swabs and analyzed their ingredients. The results showed that they are made of tough materials and contain a large number of nanoparticles including silver, aluminum, titanium, and glass fibers, all of which are not declared on the PCR test package insert. According to the professor, if these fibers get stuck in the mucous membranes they can cause severe wounds and inflammation. Mucous membranes that are no longer intact can no longer fulfill their role of fending off viruses, bacteria, and fungi before they reach the airways. The germs penetrate the respiratory tract without any immune filter. This isn't good news for those who have been compliant with the authorities' rules since the start of the alleged pandemic and take part in regular testing and mask wearing. This is because face coverings are the ideal breeding ground for all types of germs. In the laboratory, Professor Gatti used electron microscopy, ESEM and EDS, to analyze various types of swabs, which are used to collect human organic material for PCR diagnostics, in order to check the morphology and chemical composition. Professor Gatti said, the company explains that the fiber core is made of nylon with a coating of a patented material, which in the analysis, turns out to be silicate zirconium titanium. This coating makes the fiber harder so that it is able to tear the mucous membrane. There is a chance that the pressure applied during the smear maneuvers could break some fibers that remain in situ. When this happens, they can cause a foreign body reaction that can damage the mucous membrane in such a way that breathing and speech are impeded. According to the analysis by Professor Gatti, the small white dots on the picture of the swab neck are silver nanoparticles. Silver is a material that is not declared in the manufacturer's data sheet. Professor Gatti comes to the following conclusions. The porcupine swabs are made from tough fibers. If they scrape on the nasal mucosa, they can damage it, causing a bleeding lesion or, in any case, trauma to the tissue. During the healing process of the mucous membrane, the broken fibers can penetrate the tissue without an opportunity to remove them, causing the formation of a granuloma or fibrotic tissue, as happens with any foreign body. The medical devices examined are not completely biocompatible and therefore do not meet the requirements of ISO standard 10993 and the tests required to obtain the CE mark. The summary of the professor's findings were as follows. Swabs are dangerous for the nasopharyngeal mucosa. The glassy fibers, hard and brittle, can scratch the mucous membrane and create lesions. The bleeding is an indication of the invasiveness of the test. Repeated swab testing can produce chronic lesions. The release of fragments of the brittle glassy fibers can cause biological reactions such as granulomas and or fibrosis of the tissue. These smears pose a risk to the health of infants and children. So, the results are scientifically meaningless and the testing process poses a risk to the health of children. So far, so good. Right? How about this article recently published by Nexus Newsfeed, titled, PCR and quick test swabs may be cancer-causing, stop COVID testing immediately. Not only has COVID testing become a $100 billion business, it is also potentially a deadly business. PCR and quick test swabs are sterilized with the carcinogen ethylene oxide. According to the Government of Canada, the PCR test swabs are sterilized by ethylene oxide, which is described by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, as a carcinogen. In other words, a potentially cancer-causing chemical toxin. In essence, EPA says the following about the carcinogen ethylene oxide. EPA classified ethylene oxide as a human carcinogen in December 2016. Studies of workers show that their exposures to ethylene oxide are associated with an increased risk of cancers of the white blood cells, the infection-fighting cells of the immune system. Studies also showed an increased risk of breast cancer in females. Evidence in humans indicates that long-term exposure to ethylene oxide increases the risk of cancers of the white blood cells, including non-Hodgkin lymphoma, myeloma, and lymphocytic leukemia. Studies also show that long-term exposure to ethylene oxide increases the risk of breast cancer in females. EPA, as well as the International Agency for Research on Cancer and the National Toxicology Program, classifies ethylene oxide as carcinogenic to humans. Evidence in humans indicates that exposure to ethylene oxide by inhalation increases the risk of lymphohematopoietic cancers, including non-Hodgkin lymphoma, myeloma, and lymphocytic leukemia, and, for females, breast cancer. ETO is mutagenic, i.e., it can change the DNA in a cell. Children may be more susceptible to the harmful effects of mutagenic substances. RT-PCR testing. Governments, especially in Western countries, are calling frantically for more and more testing. Testing. They put people into lockdowns, the so-called third wave lockdowns, aka, illegal and totally unjustified house arrests, a complete lie, so they submit easier to the constant testing, and eventually vaccination, hoping the lockdowns will end sooner. Is it a coincidence or negligence that school children, the most vulnerable for cancerous toxin ethylene oxide, see EPA, above, are now tested regularly and repeatedly? In Switzerland, for example, the government has given the cantons, semi-autonomous departments, the authority, or a tacit order, to have school children tested at least once a month, even though they show no symptoms whatsoever. It is not only negligence, it is an outright crime. They hurt the children. And why does the swab stick have to go all the way up in the nose to a thin wall separating the sinuses from the brain cavity? Honest medical doctors tell you, even in Switzerland, this is not necessary. A swab could be taken simply from the saliva in the mouth. Knowing the big picture behind COVID, the Great Reset, or Building Back Better, in brief the UN Agenda 2030. This testing with the carcinogen-tainted swab is beyond just negligence. Is it possible, yet to be verified, that many of the health staff in the testing front line do not know about the danger for their testing subjects? Are those in senior decision-making government positions throughout the West aware of what they are doing? The Canadian government advisory states the following. If the swab is sterilized using an ethylene oxide, ETO, method, you should demonstrate that ETO and ethylene chlorohydrin, EC, residuals meet the tolerable contact limits, TCL, specified in ISO 10993-7. Commonly used swab materials, compatible sterilization methods and appropriate biological indicators are described below. Anything goes. Quietly injecting with multiple tests with swab sticks contaminated, aka sterilized, with carcinogenic agents, deep into your nose, at the entrance of the brain cavity, is just one means of creating potential cancer cases, not to mention brain damage. Such secondary effects may appear much later, years down the road, when nobody can trace them back to the COVID tests, the COVID vaccines and whatever else nefarious and diabolical tools are used in the name of combating COVID. Should the matter pertaining to the use of carcinogenic ethylene oxide be the object of an investigation? The PCR tests are useless. By now, every government knows, there is no way of ignoring it, that the PCR tests are useless. They do not allow detecting the existence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The WHO has admitted that the test as applied since January 2020 is invalid. However, most of the 193 UN member governments, with a few exceptions, run over this evidence like a steamroller, hoping the masses will not notice. They may do so probably as long as it takes to get the world population vaccinated as Bill Gates wants it. Remember, when he said, the world won't be getting back to somewhat close to normal until the 7 billion world population is vaccinated. Again, one wonders what ulterior agenda might be behind this ferocious, coercive, and human rights abusing effort of most world governments, involving the UN system as a whole. The entire vaccination hype. Everybody is strong-armed or otherwise manipulated into being vaccinated against a virus that does not need a vaccine to cure it. As we know by now, there are plenty of inexpensive but effective viral medicines that work efficiently against COVID. China had no vaccines to combat the COVID outbreak. Yet, they did it in a record time. Recently, the EU Commission ratified a vaccination passport, or certificate, without which your free movements may be tremendously hampered. It becomes increasingly clear that there is another agenda in action, a different agenda from that of protecting people's health. What are injected, especially with these non-vaccines, called mRNA jabs, never tested before, are, among other biochemicals, women and men sterilizing and fertilization inhibiting agents, as well as special electromagnetic proteins converting your body into an M field for eventual digitization, to make humans into transhumans. These modern Frankensteins could then be remotely controlled and become a walking Agenda ID 2020, so they will eventually carry all their health and other personal data in their bodies. Agenda ID 2020 is a Bill Gates creation and has already been approved in several countries, including Germany. We are not there yet. But that is the plan. Bear in mind, life is not linear, but dynamic. The Great Reset, UN Agenda 2030, Building Back Better, and other slogans to ring in the big change, are all based on linear approaches. They may work for a while. But in the long run, dynamics, the life-inherent defense system, will prevail. The danger of vaccination is multifaceted and, if carried out in the midst of what is called a pandemic, it can cause a global catastrophe a few years on, according to an interview with Dr. G. Vanden Bossche, a renowned virologist, who worked for many years for the pharma industry, notably vaccine manufacturers, including Pfizer, Moderna, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, in Geneva, physically located, by sheer coincidence, next door to the WHO. As their mother, it is your duty to protect, to defend, and to nurture the lives of these little ones above all else. As a mother, you have failed them. You have betrayed them. You have sold their precious lives to your master death. and their lives are not yours to sell. And you were cheated because you shall receive nothing in return for their debts but the crushing bounty of shame and misery which shall befall you alone. You need only to repent. Yet, you will not. You need only say the word to end this madness, yet you will not. With every ticking of the clock you reaffirm your happiness with their sacrifice for the sake of your own covert agenda. And so, I can only conclude what a sick, demented, waste of life you must be, because your debt is doubled by the cost which is paid by two and which well exceeds your worth. Your pillow is soft when you rest your head at night because you have told yourself that your conscience is clear. I cannot sleep upon the rocks in my pillow because I am helpless to do any more than I am already doing, and still their lives remain in jeopardy, made to serve the satisfaction of the covert agendas of two murderous satanic witches. And it shall be no consolation for me when I am weeping at their funerals. And you shall eternally carry the weight of the choice you have made. When it is your turn to meet your master, death, will you not regret the evil you have done?
Delightfully gruesome.